You know, some moments in motorsport aren't defined by the glory of winning a race, but by the absolute sheer miracle of survival. Today, we're going to do a deep dive, a real technical breakdown of one of the most incredible survival stories in racing history. We'll look at the engineering, the human response, everything that turned a complete catastrophe into a masterclass in safety. All right, let's get right into the physics of it. Romain Grosjean's car slammed into that barrier with a peak force of 67 G. Now, what does that even mean? Well, just imagine your own body weight and then multiply it by 67. It is an almost unbelievable force for a human being to survive. And this was the speed of the impact. He lost control at well over 240 kilometers per hour, but the car hit that guardrail at 192. At that kind of velocity, materials like metal and carbon fiber, well, they start to behave in ways you just can't predict. And that makes what happened next even more amazing. 28 seconds. If there's one number everyone remembers from that day, it's this one. That's how long Romain Grosjean was inside a fireball, with temperatures soaring up to 1,000 degrees Celsius. 28 seconds, it must have felt like a lifetime. And in those terrible moments, this was actually his reality. He later said he had this calm feeling, this acceptance, and then he thought of his children. That was the trigger. That was the thought that made him fight, that made him look for a way out of the inferno. So how did this even happen? I mean, to really understand the miracle of his survival, we first have to break down the mechanics of the failure itself. So let's start there, with the accident. The car didn't hit the barrier head-on, but at this shallow 29-degree angle, and that, combined with the insane force, caused the middle rail of that barrier to just fail. The car pierced right through it, which is a scenario that, in older eras of motorsport, was pretty much always fatal. Yeah, the impact was so violent, it literally tore the car in two. The entire rear end, the engine, the gearbox, was ripped away from the driver's cockpit. Now, part of this is actually by design. Having the car break apart helps dissipate a massive amount of energy. But here's the unintended consequence. A fuel hatch was forced open and a fuel line was cut, and that's what sparked the massive fire. So you have a car in two pieces, wedged in a barrier, and completely engulfed in flames. How does anyone survive that? This is where the engineering of the survival cell comes into play. Because even as the rest of the car was obliterated, this central part did its number one job: protect the driver. Let's look at the key pieces of tech that made it happen. The first and most important line of defense is this: the survival cell, or the monocoque. For any of you aspiring motorsport engineers, this is the heart and soul of safety design. It's an incredibly strong shell made of carbon fiber and Kevlar. And in this crash, it performed perfectly, staying completely intact as a protective pod that absorbed that 67G impact and shielded Grosjean from the worst of it. And then there's the halo. Man, this thing was so controversial when it was introduced back in 2018. People hated the way it looked. Grosjean himself was publicly against it at first. But after this crash, well, let's just say there are no more arguments. To give you an idea of just how strong the halo is, get this. The titanium structure is built to withstand about 12,000 kilograms of force. That's basically the weight of a double-decker bus. It is, by regulation, the single strongest part of an F1 car. And like F1's director of motorsport, Ross Brawn, said, the halo was the absolute difference maker. As the car went through the guardrail, the halo acted like a shield. It literally parted the steel barrier, pushing the rails up and away from Grosjean's helmet. Without it, that impact would have been directly to his head, and we'd be telling a very different story today. It kept him conscious and gave him a chance to get out. Okay, so surviving the impact is one thing, but surviving the fire? That's a whole different challenge. And that brings us to the next layer of survival: the driver's own gear and the incredible rapid response from the medical team. And this is just an incredible piece of luck, really. A brand new, tougher fire protection standard was introduced by the FIA for the 2020 season. The suit Grosjean was wearing had about 20% more heat protection. It was designed to resist that intense heat for a minimum of 12 seconds. It held up for 28. That gave him the precious time he needed to get himself out before his gloves started to melt. The human response here was every bit as critical as the car's engineering. Because the crash happened on lap 1, the FIA medical car was right there, just seconds behind the pack, which is standard procedure. It was on the scene in an unbelievable 11 seconds. Dr. Ian Roberts was right there to help a dazed Grosjean climb over the barrier. It was a flawless execution of a life-saving drill. So, a crash like this is a catastrophic failure, no doubt. But for engineers, it is also an invaluable, if pretty brutal, source of data. So, how does the sports governing body, the FIA, actually learn from an incident like this to make sure it doesn't happen again? Right, this is where the real forensic work begins for the engineering teams. They have a whole toolkit of sensors. There's a high-speed camera pointed right at the driver, filming at 400 frames per second, so they see exactly what happens to the human body. The car has its own black box that records all the forces, and they even have tiny accelerometers inside the driver's earpieces to measure the exact G-forces on the head. Every single bit of data gets used to turn this disaster into a lesson. And that lesson? It leads directly to evolution. The findings from the FIA's investigation don't just sit in a report on some shelf. No way. They are already being used to shape the future of safety in motorsport. So for any of you who want to become an engineer in this sport, this is what that process looks like in the real world. From this one crash, the FIA identified over 20 key areas for more research. Things like, how do we make the fuel systems even more secure? How can we improve the heat protection in the gloves? These aren't just ideas, they are real, tangible engineering problems for the next generation to go out and solve. Look, Romain Grosjean survived because of a whole chain of innovations: the survival cell, the head and neck support, the fireproof suit, and of course, the halo. And every single one of those was created because of a previous tragedy. It's a relentless cycle of learning. And it leaves us with one final thought. What risks are still out there that we haven't seen yet? And what piece of engineering, maybe one that you will design, is going to be the next lifesaver?